Sarah Brennan pressed her 3-month-old daughter closer to her chest as the courthouse gavel cracked like a gunshot through the frozen January air. Snow fell thick outside the windows of Caribou Creek, Colorado Territory, but inside the makeshift auction room, 40 pairs of eyes appraised her with a heat that made her skin crawl. Her baby, Grace, whimpered against the cold, and Sarah's arms tightened. This couldn't be happening. Not in America. Not to a widow whose only crime was marrying a man whose father was a liar and a thief. Before we continue Sarah's story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button right now. Stay with us until the very end to see how one man's courage changed 2 lives forever. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to that courthouse in Caribou Creek, where Sarah's fate hung in the balance. Lot 17, the auctioneer bellowed, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. One healthy woman, aged 24, literate, skilled in household management, infant girl included. Terms are final sale to satisfy debts of the estate of Harold Brennan, deceased. Opening bid set at $15. Sarah's vision blurred. $15. Less than a horse, less than a plow. She was worth less than livestock because she came with a baby. This ain't right, Judge Morrison. A woman's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. Sarah recognized Mrs. Chen, the laundress, who'd given her extra work after Thomas died. You can't sell a widow like she's property. There's laws. The law is clear, Mrs. Chen. Judge Morrison's voice was cold as the January wind rattling the windows. Mrs. Brennan resided in her father-in-law's household as a dependent. When Harold Brennan died, intestate, with debts exceeding assets, all household property became subject to creditor claims. That includes persons financially dependent on the estate. She's a human being, Mrs. Chen's voice shook, with a baby. She's also 3 months behind on room and board, owed to the boarding house, with no means of payment. The judge adjusted his spectacles. Mrs. Patterson has generously agreed to accept the proceeds from this sale in lieu of eviction and criminal charges for theft of services. Sarah felt her knees weaken. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, who'd promised to help, who'd taken Sarah in after Harold Brennan's sudden death, stood in the corner wearing a dress of purple silk that cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. The older woman's eyes were hard as river stones. "Theft?" Sarah whispered. "I worked for you. I cleaned every room. I cooked. You ate my food and burned my coal," Mrs. Patterson snapped, "with a squalling infant keeping my paying guests awake. You owe me, girl," and Judge Morrison agrees. $15, a voice called from the back. "I'll start it." Sarah's head jerked up. The speaker was Dutch Hansen, who ran the Silver Bell Saloon. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her stomach turn. "20, called another voice. Frank Cooper, the mine foreman whose wife had died last spring. He was 60 if he was a day, with hands like bear paws and breath that reeked of whiskey. 25. This from a stranger Sarah didn't recognize, a thin man in a fine coat, his smile cold and calculating. Grace began to cry in earnest now, sensing her mother's terror. Sarah bounced her gently, whispering nonsense words that caught in her throat. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, she'd been a respectable wife in St. Louis. Thomas had been alive, his bookkeeping business modest but steady. Then the fever came. 30, Dutch Hansen said again, louder now, playing to the crowd. Thomas died on a Tuesday. His father, Harold, followed on Friday, not from fever, but from apoplexy, when he discovered the extent of his own gambling debts. The creditors descended like vultures. The business, the house, the furniture, every last spoon and handkerchief, all sold. Sarah had fled to Colorado Territory with baby Grace and $40 in her pocket, hoping to reach her cousin in Denver. She'd made it as far as Caribou Creek before the money ran out. 35. Frank Cooper's voice was eager now. The boarding house had seemed like salvation. Mrs. Patterson had been so kind at first, so understanding. "Stay as long as you need, dear. We'll work something out." But the work was never enough. The debts kept mounting. And then, 3 days ago, the sheriff had come with papers signed by Judge Morrison himself. "Mrs. Brennan," the judge had said, "you are hereby remanded to custody pending resolution of debts owed. You will be housed at county expense until such time as arrangements can be made for repayment through labor or sale of contract." Sale of contract. Such clean words for such a dirty thing. $40. Dutch Hansen's voice rose above the wind, howling outside. "And I'll take them both, woman and brat. Got rooms above the saloon that need filling." Sarah's vision darkened at the edges. Grace's cries intensified, and she pressed her daughter's face against her shoulder, trying to muffle the sound. She wouldn't let Grace see this, wouldn't let her daughter's first memories be of this moment. 45. The thin stranger in the fine coat said with a smile, "Though I question the value of a woman with such obvious encumbrances." "Watch your mouth." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame rigid with fury. "That baby is a blessing, not a burden." "Then you bid for her," the stranger shot back, "or hold your peace." Mrs. Chen's face crumpled. Sarah knew why. The laundress worked 14-hour days just to feed her own 4 children. There was no money for heroic gestures. $50. Frank Cooper's voice cut through the tension. "Final offer. I need a housekeeper, and the baby won't be no trouble once she's weaned." Once she's weaned, the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. He meant to separate them, take Grace away, once she was old enough to survive without her mother. "No." The word tore from Sarah's throat before she could stop it. "Please, Judge Morrison, there has to be another way. I'll work anywhere, do anything. Just don't." "The bidding is open," Judge Morrison said flatly. "You have no standing to object." $60, Dutch Hansen grinned. "And I'll even let her keep the kid. Got a crib in storage from my sister's youngest." The crowd murmured. $60 was serious money. Sarah felt the room closing in. The Silver Bell Saloon, working for Dutch Hansen. The implications were clear to everyone in that courthouse, even if no one spoke them aloud. "Please," Sarah whispered. "Not to the judge, not to any man in that room. Just up to whatever power might be listening. Please." The courthouse door crashed open. Snow and wind roared in, along with a man Sarah had never seen before. He was tall, over 6 feet, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat dusted with fresh powder. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark hair, a strong jaw shadowed with 2 days' stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He moved like a man used to hard country, economical and sure. "Auction still going?" His voice carried despite the wind. "Close that door," Judge Morrison barked. "You're letting in the weather." The stranger complied, then turned to face the room. His gaze swept across the crowd, paused on Sarah and Grace, then moved to the judge. I asked if the auction's still open. It is, the judge frowned. And you are? Name's Daniel Frost. I have a ranch 20 miles north of here. Heard you were selling off Harold Brennan's estate. The estate's gone, Dutch Hansen called. We're down to the dregs now. His daughter-in-law and her brat. Daniel Frost's jaw tightened. His eyes cut to Dutch, with a look that made the saloon keeper shift his weight. I heard, Daniel said quietly. That's why I'm here. Sarah's heart hammered. Who was this man? Why would he ride 20 miles through a January snowstorm to attend an auction? Current bid is $60, Judge Morrison said. From Mr. Hansen, do you wish to bid? Daniel Frost stepped forward, shaking snow from his shoulders. As he moved closer to the front of the room, Sarah could see him more clearly. Weathered skin from sun and wind, hands that had seen hard labor, boots worn but well maintained. Not a rich man, but not destitute either. 75, Daniel said. The courthouse erupted in whispers. Sarah clutched Grace tighter, her mind spinning. Who was this stranger? 80, Dutch Hansen's face had gone red. And I'll thank you to mind your own business, Frost. 100. Daniel's voice cut through the noise like a knife. No hesitation, no doubt. The whispers died. $100 was a fortune. It was 3 months' wages for a laborer. It was a down payment on good land. It was 110, Frank Cooper called. But his voice had lost its confidence. 150. Sarah's breath caught. Daniel Frost hadn't even blinked. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his expression calm. But his eyes, those gray eyes, never left the judge's face. This is insane, the thin stranger in the fine coat muttered. She's not worth $150. Do I hear 160? Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp. Silence. Frank Cooper shook his head. Dutch Hansen's face was purple with rage, but he said nothing. The thin stranger laughed bitterly and turned toward the door. 150, going once. The judge's gavel hovered. Going twice. Sarah couldn't breathe. Grace had quieted, her small hand fisted in Sarah's threadbare shawl. The baby's blue eyes, so like Thomas's, stared up at her mother with perfect trust. Sold. The gavel cracked down. To Mr. Daniel Frost for $150. The room erupted again, voices overlapping. That's 3 months' profit from my best girls. Fool, and his money. Frost always was soft-headed about women. Sarah heard none of it. Her ears rang, her vision tunneled. The stranger, Daniel Frost, was approaching the judge's bench, pulling a leather wallet from inside his coat. She watched, disconnected from her own body, as he counted out bills, real money, not scrip or promises, but actual currency. Judge Morrison examined each bill, then nodded. The sale is final and binding. Mrs. Brennan and her infant Oz are remanded to your custody, Mr. Frost, along with all the associated debts and obligations. There ain't no obligations, Mrs. Patterson called from her corner. She's got nothing but the clothes on her back and that baby. Everything else was sold to cover her keep. Daniel Frost turned to look at the boarding house owner. The expression on his face made Mrs. Patterson take a step back. Ma'am, he said quietly, you just sold a woman and child to pay for 3 months' room and board. If I were you, I'd spend the rest of my days praying for forgiveness, not counting coins. Mrs. Patterson's face went white, then red. How dare you? Daniel, Judge Morrison's voice held a warning. The sale is concluded. Take your property and go. Property. Sarah flinched at the word. Daniel Frost's jaw tightened. but he nodded. He turned to face Sarah fully for the first time. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, broad-shouldered beneath the heavy coat. But his expression as he looked at her and Grace was nothing like Dutch Hansen's leer or Frank Cooper's hungry appraisal. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know you're frightened, but I give you my word. You and your daughter are safe with me." Sarah wanted to believe him desperately, but she'd believed Mrs. Patterson too, and Thomas's father, and the lawyer who'd promised to protect her inheritance. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she whispered. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or recognition. "No, ma'am, you don't. But I promise you this. Once we're at my ranch, once you've had time to rest and think, we'll talk about what comes next. You'll have choices then." "Frost," Dutch Hansen's voice was ugly now, "you just bought yourself a heap of trouble. Woman like that with a bastard baby." Daniel moved so fast, Sarah gasped. One moment he was standing still. The next, he had Dutch Hansen pressed against the wall, one hand fisted in the saloon keeper's collar. "You say one more word about this lady or her daughter," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more terrifying than a shout, "and I'll make sure you're spitting teeth for a week. Understand?" Dutch Hansen's eyes bulged. He nodded frantically. Daniel released him and stepped back, adjusting his coat with deliberate calm. "Sorry, ma'am," he said to Sarah, "but I won't have men speaking about you that way." Sarah stared at him. Grace had started to whimper again, and Sarah realized her own hands were shaking. "We should go," Daniel said. "Storm's getting worse." Sarah's voice cracked. "I don't have anything to pack. They took everything." "Do you have a coat? Something warm?" She shook her head. The coat she'd worn from St. Louis had been sold weeks ago to pay for firewood. Daniel's expression darkened. Without a word, he shrugged out of his sheepskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was huge on her and still warm from his body. It smelled of wood smoke and horses and something else, something clean and safe. "What about you?" she asked. "I've got a heavy shirt, and I'm used to the cold. Come on." He didn't touch her, didn't try to take Grace or her arm. He simply turned and walked toward the courthouse door, clearly expecting her to follow. Sarah looked back once, at the crowd, at Mrs. Chen, whose eyes were bright with tears, at Mrs. Patterson, whose face was twisted with resentment, at Judge Morrison, who was already shuffling papers for the next piece of business. Then she looked down at Grace, whose small fist was now clutching the lapel of Daniel Frost's coat. Sarah followed him out into the storm. The cold hit her like a fist, despite the borrowed coat. Snow drove sideways, already accumulating in drifts against the buildings. Main Street was nearly empty. Only a fool would be out in weather like this, or a desperate man riding to an auction. Daniel led her to a covered wagon hitched to two sturdy horses, not fancy, but well-built and well-maintained. He'd lined the bed with hay and blankets. "For you and the baby," he explained, raising his voice over the wind. "I'll ride alongside on Buck." He nodded toward a third horse, a big gray gelding tied to the wagon. "Can you drive?" "Yes." Sarah had grown up on a farm in Ohio before her father's death forced her to move to St. Louis. Driving a wagon was second nature. "Good." Daniel helped her up onto the seat, his hand steadying her elbow without presumption. Once she was settled, he reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a thick buffalo robe. Wrap this around you and the baby. It's going to be a cold ride." "How far?" Sarah asked through chattering teeth. 20 miles, 3 hours if the road's clear, longer if the snow keeps up." He glanced at the sky, which was slate gray and heavy. "We might have to shelter at the Hendersons' place halfway. They're good people." Sarah nodded, tucking the buffalo robe around herself and Grace. The baby was blessedly quiet now, perhaps lulled by exhaustion or the sudden warmth. Daniel secured his horse to the back of the wagon, then swung up onto Buck with easy grace. "Stay close behind me," he called. "The road's marked with posts, but the snow can hide them. If you get confused or scared, just follow Buck. He knows the way home." Home. The word struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had no home. She was traveling into the wilderness with a man she didn't know. A man who'd just bought her like a sack of flour. But as Daniel Frost urged Buck forward and the wagon lurched into motion, Sarah realized she had no choice but to trust him. At least, she thought, gripping the reins with numb fingers, he'd called her ma'am and given her his coat. That was more respect than anyone in Caribou Creek had shown her in 3 months. The town disappeared behind them within minutes, swallowed by snow and distance. The world narrowed to the rump of Buck ahead, the creak of the wagon, and the whistle of wind through the canvas cover. Grace dozed against Sarah's chest, her small body a point of warmth beneath the buffalo robe. An hour passed. Sarah's hands ached from gripping the reins. Her face was numb despite the coat's high collar, but she kept the horses steady, following Buck's steady pace through the deepening snow. Daniel looked back frequently, checking on them. Each time he'd raise his hand in a small gesture, reassurance or encouragement. Sarah found herself watching for those moments. They were her only anchor in the white void. Another hour. The snow was falling thicker now, the wind driving it into drifts that reached halfway up the wagon wheels. Sarah's arms trembled with fatigue. She'd eaten nothing since yesterday morning, a piece of hard bread Mrs. Patterson had thrown at her with contempt. The world began to blur at the edges. "Ma'am," Daniel's voice cut through the wind. He'd stopped Buck and was riding back toward the wagon. "Henderson's place is just ahead. We need to stop." Sarah tried to answer, but her jaw was too stiff to form words. She managed to nod. Daniel dismounted and came to her side of the wagon. "Can you get down?" She tried. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground. Daniel caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist, the other steadying Grace. "I've got you," he said. "Just hold on." He half carried her toward a structure that materialized from the snow, a cabin small but solid, with smoke rising from its chimney. Daniel pounded on the door. "Henderson, it's Daniel Frost." The door opened, revealing a bearded man in his 50s and a woman with gray-streaked hair. Their eyes widened at the sight of Daniel supporting Sarah and the baby. "Lord have mercy," the woman, Mrs. Henderson, breathed. "Get them inside. Quickly." The cabin was blissfully warm. Sarah felt sensation returning to her face and hands in painful prickles. Mrs. Henderson took Grace from her arms with practiced efficiency. "This baby's half frozen," she scolded, but her hands were gentle as she unwrapped Grace from the buffalo robe. "And you, child, when did you last eat?" "Yesterday," Sarah managed through chattering teeth. Mrs. Henderson made a noise of pure disgust. "Men, I swear." But she was looking at Daniel with more confusion than anger. "Daniel Frost, what in heaven's name are you doing with a woman and baby in weather like this?" Long story, Daniel said. He was rubbing his arms now, trying to warm himself after giving up his coat. Is there coffee? There's stew and bread and coffee enough for an army. Mrs. Henderson deposited Grace in her husband's arms. The baby immediately began fussing and bustled toward the stove. Henderson, stop gawking and help this woman to a chair. The next hour passed in a blur of warmth and food and questions. Sarah ate mechanically, barely tasting the venison stew or the fresh bread. Grace nursed hungrily, then fell into an exhausted sleep in Sarah's arms. The Hendersons asked no questions, though their eyes held 100. Finally, when Sarah's shivers had subsided and color had returned to her face, Mrs. Henderson spoke. "You can't go on in this weather," she said firmly. "You'll freeze to death. The storm's getting worse." Mr. Henderson agreed, peering out the window. "Can't see more than 20 feet. Daniel looked at Sarah. "They're right. We need to wait it out." Sarah nodded. She was too exhausted to argue, too numb to care. "We've got a spare room," Mrs. Henderson said. "Small but private. You and the baby can rest there." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. Mrs. Henderson led her to a tiny room, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. But the bed had clean blankets, and the room was warm. Grace was already asleep. Sarah laid her daughter down carefully, then sank onto the edge of the mattress. Through the thin walls, she could hear Daniel talking to the Hendersons, their voices low, but occasional words carried. "Bought her at auction. Judge Morrison said it was legal." "Not right, Daniel. A woman's not property." "I know that. Why do you think I bid?" Silence. Then Mrs. Henderson's voice, softer now. "What are you going to do with her?" "Give her a choice," Daniel said. "Once she's rested, once she feels safe, she'll decide what happens next." "And if she chooses to leave?" A long pause. "Then I'll give her money and a horse and my blessing." Sarah closed her eyes. A choice. He'd said that before, but she'd had choices before too, or so she'd thought, and every one had led her to that courthouse, to that auction block, to being sold like livestock. She pulled Grace close and let exhaustion pull her under. When she woke, the room was dark and the cabin was silent. Disoriented, Sarah sat up. Grace was still sleeping peacefully beside her. Pale moonlight filtered through the small window. The storm had passed. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and crept to the door. Opening it a crack, she saw the main room lit by firelight. Daniel Frost sat in a chair near the hearth, staring into the flames. He'd changed into a dry shirt, Mrs. Henderson's doing, probably, and his hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He looked tired and young somehow, without his hat and coat. Maybe 30, maybe less. Too young to have the kind of money he'd spent at that auction. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the dim room. "How's the baby?" he asked quietly. "Sleeping." Sarah stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. The Hendersons. Asleep in their room. He gestured to a chair across from him. "You should sleep too. Long ride tomorrow." Sarah sat, but she didn't feel sleepy anymore. She felt wired, full of questions that had been building since that moment in the courthouse. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Do what?" "You know what?" She leaned forward. $150 for a woman you'd never met, and a baby that's not yours. Why? Daniel was quiet for a long time, his gaze returning to the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "My mother died when I was 10, he said. "Childbirth. The baby, my sister, only lived 3 days. He paused. My father remarried within the year. Had to. Couldn't run the ranch alone with 3 sons to raise. Sarah waited. Martha, my stepmother. She was a widow herself. Had 2 young children of her own. The arrangement was purely practical. Father needed help. Martha needed security. He smiled faintly. But it became more than that. They grew to love each other, and she loved us boys like we were her own. She sounds like a good woman. She was. His smile faded. When I was 17, my father got thrown from a horse. Broke his neck, died instantly. He rubbed his jaw. That's when the trouble started. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. My father's brother came from back east, Uncle Lawrence. He contested the will, said Martha had no legal claim to the ranch, that it should pass to blood relatives. The judge agreed. Daniel's voice went flat. Martha and her children were turned out with nothing. The ranch I'd worked on my whole life, that my father had promised would be mine and my brother's, gone. Given to a man who'd never set foot on the property before. That's horrible. Martha died that winter. Pneumonia. She'd been living in a boarding house in Denver, taking in laundry. He met Sarah's eyes. Her children ended up in an orphanage. I tried to get them out, but I was barely 18 with no money and no prospects. By the time I'd saved enough to go back for them, they'd been sent east on one of those orphan trains. I never found them. Sarah's throat tightened. I swore that day, Daniel said, that if I ever had the means, I'd never let that happen to another woman. I'd never let someone lose everything just because the law said they had no rights. He leaned back in his chair. So when I heard Judge Morrison was auctioning off Harold Brennan's daughter-in-law to pay debts, I rode straight to Caribou Creek. You didn't know me? Sarah whispered. Didn't matter. I knew what you were facing. He held her gaze. And I couldn't let it happen. Not again. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Sarah's hands were shaking again, but not from cold. What happens now? She asked finally. Daniel stood and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. Tomorrow we ride to my ranch. It's nothing fancy. A house, a barn, some cattle, chickens. I have 2 hands who work for me, brothers named Carlos and Miguel. Good men. They live in the bunkhouse. He turned back to her. You and Grace will have your own room. I'll sleep in the barn until we figure out... He stopped, choosing his words carefully. Until we figure out what you want. What I want? Sarah laughed, a broken sound. I want my husband back. I want Harold Brennan to have never gambled away everything my family owned. I want to have never walked into that courthouse. Her voice cracked. But I don't get what I want. No one asks women what they want. I'm asking. Sarah looked up at him, at this stranger who'd spent a fortune to save her, at this man whose mother and stepmother had both been failed by the men in their lives, at this cowboy standing in a borrowed cabin promising her choices she didn't believe existed. I want Grace to be safe, she said finally. That's all I have left to want. Daniel nodded slowly. Then that's what you'll have. I promise you, Sarah Brennan. As long as you're under my protection, no one will harm your daughter or you. It was the first time he'd used her name. It sounded strange in his voice. Careful, respectful. Why should I trust you? The question came out harsher than she'd intended. Daniel didn't flinch. You shouldn't. Trust has to be earned, and I'm a stranger to you. He moved back to his chair and sat down. But I'll earn it, however long it takes. Sarah studied his face in the firelight, looking for deception, for hidden motives, for the catch that surely existed somewhere in this arrangement. But all she saw was a tired man who'd ridden through a blizzard to buy a woman's freedom. Not her, a woman. Any woman in that position. The realization settled over her like a blanket. He hadn't saved her specifically, he'd saved the situation. She was still just a problem to be solved, a debt to his dead stepmother, to be repaid. "I'll work," she said abruptly, "to repay you. I can cook and clean and tend animals. I'll earn my keep." "That's not necessary." "It is to me." Sarah stood. "I won't be anyone's charity case. Not yours, not Mrs. Patterson's, not anyone's. If I'm staying at your ranch, I'm working for my place there." Daniel watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, if that's what you need." "It is." "Then we'll work out an arrangement. Fair wages for fair work." "I don't need wages, I need—" Sarah stopped, unsure what she needed. Security, respect, a future that wasn't bound to any man's whims. "You need choices," Daniel finished quietly. "I understand." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. The borrowed nightgown Mrs. Henderson had given her was too large, slipping off one shoulder. She felt exposed, vulnerable, standing in this strange cabin with this strange man who claimed to want nothing from her. "I should go back to bed," she said. "Yes, ma'am." That word again, ma'am. As if she were a respectable woman instead of property he'd purchased for $150. Sarah turned toward the bedroom, then paused. "Mr. Frost?" "Yes?" "Thank you for what you did today. Whatever your reasons, you saved us." "Daniel," he said. "Just Daniel." "And you're welcome, Sarah." She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding. In the bed, Grace slept on, unaware that her mother's life had just changed course once again. Sarah climbed back under the blankets and pulled her daughter close. Through the wall, she heard Daniel settle back into his chair, the creak of wood, the whisper of him stoking the fire. Outside, the moon cast silver light across the snow. The storm had passed, but the cold remained. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what waited for her at the end of tomorrow's journey. A ranch, a room of her own, a man who promised her choices. It sounded too good to be true. And in Sarah's experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually were. But as Grace's small hand curled against her chest and exhaustion pulled her down, Sarah made herself a promise. Whatever happened at Daniel Frost's ranch, she would survive it. She would protect her daughter, and she would never, ever stand on another auction block again, even if it meant learning to trust a stranger who'd bought her freedom. Even if it meant believing in second chances she'd stopped believing in months ago. Even if it meant hoping just a little that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The fire burned low in the main room. Daniel sat watching the flames, unable to sleep. He'd done it. He'd actually gone through with the insane plan that had formed the moment he'd heard about the auction. $150, half his savings, money he'd been setting aside for breeding stock come spring, gone, spent on a woman and baby he didn't know. His foreman, Carlos, was going to think he'd lost his mind. His brother, Marcus, working a claim up in Silver Peak, was going to laugh until he cried. And maybe they'd be right. But Daniel couldn't shake the image that had driven him through that blizzard. Martha's face, the day Uncle Lawrence had turned them out of the ranch. The helpless rage Daniel had felt as a 17-year-old, watching his stepmother and her children forced from their home with nothing. He'd been powerless then. He wasn't powerless now. The memory of Sarah Brennan standing on that courthouse floor, holding her baby with desperate strength while men bid on her like she was livestock, it had filled him with the same rage, the same determination. He'd saved her. That much was done. Now came the hard part, earning her trust, proving he wasn't like the men who'd failed her before, creating a space where she could heal and decide her own future. Daniel rubbed his eyes. He hadn't thought past the auction, hadn't really planned for what happened after. He'd just known he had to act. Well, he'd acted, and now he had a terrified widow and a 3-month-old baby depending on him. "God help me," he muttered to the dying fire. "Don't let me fail them." Outside, an owl called through the cold night. The wind had died down, leaving only silence and starlight. Tomorrow, they'd reach the ranch. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, Daniel Frost sat vigil in a borrowed cabin and prayed that his impulsive decision to save Sarah Brennan wouldn't destroy them both. In the small bedroom, Sarah's breathing had evened into sleep. Grace dozed peacefully, her small fist clutching her mother's nightgown. Neither of them heard Daniel add wood to the fire, or saw him settle into the chair for the long, cold watch until dawn. Neither of them knew that tomorrow's journey would be only the beginning of something neither could yet imagine. But in the darkness, in the silence between heartbeats, something shifted. A door had opened. A path had appeared. And though neither Sarah nor Daniel knew it yet, they'd both just taken the first step toward home. Must dawn were cold and clear. Sarah woke to Grace's hungry whimpering and the smell of coffee drifting through the cabin walls. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then yesterday crashed back. The auction, Daniel Frost, the storm. She sat up, her body aching from exhaustion and tension. Grace's face was red, her small mouth working in pre-cry frustration. Sarah quickly nursed her, grateful for the privacy of the small room. Through the thin walls, she heard voices, Daniel and the Hendersons discussing the road conditions. "Drifts are deep, but passable," Mr. Henderson was saying. "Should make it to your place by midday, if you start soon." "Appreciate the hospitality," Daniel replied, "and the discretion." "We won't speak of it," Mrs. Henderson's voice was firm. "That poor girl's been through enough without becoming gossip fodder." Sarah's throat tightened. She finished feeding Grace and dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, the only clothes she owned. When she emerged from the bedroom, Mrs. Henderson was packing food into a basket. "For the journey," the older woman said, pressing it into Sarah's hands. "Bread and cheese and some dried apples. The baby looks healthy, but you're too thin, child." "Thank you." Sarah's voice came out rough. "For everything." Mrs. Henderson cupped Sarah's face with one calloused hand. "You listen to me. Daniel Frost is a good man. Knew his stepmother, Martha. She spoke highly of him. He'll treat you right." Her eyes searched Sarah's. "But if he doesn't, if anything goes wrong, you come back here. Understand? This door is always open to you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The journey to Daniel's ranch was nothing like the terror-filled flight through the blizzard. The morning sun turned the snow-covered landscape into something beautiful, almost peaceful. Daniel rode ahead on Buck. Sarah followed with the wagon, Grace bundled against her chest. The road was clear enough to follow, marked by fence posts, and the tracks Daniel's horse left in the fresh powder. They stopped once to rest the horses. Daniel helped Sarah down from the wagon seat, his hands careful and brief at her waist. He didn't speak much, just checked that Grace was warm enough, and offered Sarah water from his canteen. "How much farther?" Sarah asked. 2 hours, maybe less." He looked at the sky, gauging something in the angle of the sun. "We'll be there before noon." Sarah wanted to ask more about the ranch, about what would be expected of her, about the 2 hands he'd mentioned. But Daniel had already turned back to Buck. He wasn't cold exactly, but he wasn't warm either. Just distant, as if yesterday's conversation by the fire had never happened. Maybe he regretted it. Regretted spending that money. Regretted the impulse that had driven him to that courthouse. Sarah climbed back into the wagon and picked up the reins. She couldn't afford to care about Daniel Frost's regrets. She had to focus on survival, on Grace, on the choices he'd promised her, if those choices were real. The ranch appeared gradually, revealing itself as they crested a low hill. Sarah's first thought was that it was smaller than she'd expected. Just a simple house, 1-story wood frame with a stone chimney, a large barn, a chicken coop, and a bunkhouse set back from the main building. Cattle dotted the snow-covered pastures, dark shapes against white. A thin line of smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even particularly pretty. But it looked solid, permanent, real. 2 men emerged from the barn as they approached. Both were young, early 20s, Sarah guessed, with dark hair and darker eyes. They wore heavy coats and work gloves, and they stopped dead when they saw the wagon. "Boss," the taller one's voice carried across the yard, "that you?" "It's me, Carlos." Daniel dismounted and led Buck toward the barn. "This is Mrs. Brennan and her daughter, Grace. They'll be staying with us." The 2 men exchanged glances. The shorter one, Miguel, Sarah assumed, stepped forward and pulled his hat off. "Ma'am," he said, "welcome to the Frost Ranch." Sarah managed a nod. She felt their curiosity like a physical thing, but neither man asked questions. They just helped Daniel unhitch the wagon horses and started hauling gear into the barn with quick efficiency. "I'll show you the house," Daniel said to Sarah. "Carlos, Miguel, tend the horses, then come up for coffee. We need to talk." The house was cold inside, the hearth empty. Daniel moved immediately to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced movements. Sarah stood just inside the door, holding Grace, not sure where to go or what to do. "Your room is through there." Daniel nodded toward a doorway on the left without looking up from the kindling. "Only bedroom in the house. I've been sleeping out here by the fire, so it's yours now." Sarah moved to the doorway and looked in. The room was small but clean. A bed with a quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand, a window looking out toward the mountains, and in the corner, a wooden cradle. "I made that last night," Daniel said behind her. His voice was carefully neutral. "After we got back from the Hendersons. Figured the baby needed somewhere safe to sleep." Sarah turned to stare at him. "You made this last night?" "Couldn't sleep anyway." He was back at the fireplace, coaxing the flames higher. "It's rough work, but it'll hold." Sarah set Grace in the cradle and ran her fingers over the smooth wood. The joints were tight, the runners even. This wasn't rough work. This was carpentry, careful and skilled. "Thank you," she said. Daniel just nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. Sarah sank onto the bed and put her face in her hands. She was here. at a stranger's ranch in the middle of the Colorado Territory, with no money and no way to leave, dependent on a man who'd bought her at auction and now wouldn't meet her eyes. Grace began to fuss in the cradle. Sarah picked her up and held her close, breathing in the sweet baby smell of her daughter's hair. "We're going to be all right," she whispered. "We have to be." When she emerged from the bedroom, the main room had transformed. The fire blazed in the hearth. Daniel had set a pot of coffee on to boil and was slicing bread at a rough wooden table. Carlos and Miguel sat on a bench near the fire, their hats in their laps, looking uncertain. "Mrs. Brennan," Daniel said without turning around. "This is Carlos and Miguel Rivera. They've worked for me for 2 years. Good men, both of them." "Ma'am." Carlos stood. "We're pleased to have you here." "Very pleased," Miguel added quickly. "It's been all men for too long. Place needs a woman's touch." Sarah wanted to ask what that meant, but Daniel was already pouring coffee into tin cups. "Sit," he said to Sarah, nodding toward the table. "We need to discuss arrangements." Sarah sat, Grace in her lap. The 3 men arrayed themselves around the table, Daniel across from her, Carlos and Miguel on either side. It felt formal, deliberate. "Mrs. Brennan has agreed to work for her keep," Daniel began. His voice was businesslike. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the chickens, whatever needs doing around the house." "That's not necessary, boss," Carlos said. It's what she wants." Daniel's tone left no room for argument. "She'll be paid fair wages, $20 a month, plus room and board." $20. Sarah's breath caught. That was more than most women earned for domestic work. "That's too much," she said. "It's standard for a ranch housekeeper," Daniel replied. "Carlos and Miguel make 30 each, but they handle livestock and heavy labor. 20 is fair for house management." "I'm not a housekeeper. Sarah stopped. What was she? Property Daniel had purchased. A charity case. A woman with nowhere else to go. "You're someone who works for wages," Daniel said quietly. "Same as the rest of us, if that's what you want to be." Sarah met his eyes. They were steady, unreadable, giving her nothing to react against. "All right," she said. $20. "Good." Daniel turned to Carlos and Miguel. "You two keep to the bunkhouse, unless you're invited to the main house. Mrs. Brennan's privacy is to be respected at all times. Understood?" "Yes, boss," they said in unison. "One more thing." Daniel's voice hardened slightly. "Anyone in town asks about Mrs. Brennan, you say she's my housekeeper, nothing more. Her business is her own." Carlos and Miguel nodded solemnly. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. He was protecting her reputation, or what was left of it. "Now get back to work," Daniel said. "Those fences in the north pasture won't mend themselves." The 2 men filed out, pulling their hats low against the cold. When the door closed behind them, Daniel stood and moved to the window, his back to Sarah. "I need to ride out with them," he said. "Check the herd. Make sure none got caught in the storm. I'll be back before dark." "What should I do?" Sarah asked. "Whatever you want. Rest if you need to. There's food in the pantry and firewood stacked outside." He finally turned to look at her. "This is your home now, Sarah. At least for as long as you choose to stay. You don't need my permission to exist here." He left before she could respond. Sarah sat alone in the quiet house, Grace dozing in her arms, and tried to understand what had just happened. Daniel Frost had bought her freedom, given her work and wages, protected her privacy and reputation. And now he was treating her like what? A tenant? An employee? a guest who might leave at any moment. She didn't know, couldn't figure him out. And that uncertainty was almost worse than the courthouse had been, because at least there she'd known what men wanted from her. Daniel Frost seemed to want nothing at all. Sarah spent the afternoon exploring the house. It was sparse, but well maintained. The main room held the fireplace, the table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair that looked handmade. The kitchen was a corner of the main room with a cast iron stove, a pump for water, and shelves lined with supplies. The pantry held flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, and preserves, enough to feed 4 people through a hard winter. In the bedroom, Sarah found more surprises. The chest of drawers held men's clothes. Daniel's, obviously. But he'd cleared out 2 drawers completely, leaving them empty for her, even though she had nothing to put in them. She opened the 3rd drawer and found something that made her throat close up. Baby clothes, tiny gowns and caps, carefully folded, smelling faintly of cedar. Old, but well preserved. Sarah lifted one small gown. The fabric was soft with age, the stitching neat and even. Someone had made these with love. Someone had dressed a baby in these clothes and held that baby close. Martha, Daniel's stepmother. These must have been her children's clothes, saved all these years. Sarah carefully refolded the gown and closed the drawer. She couldn't use them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. They felt too precious, too weighted with someone else's grief. Grace woke, hungry, and Sarah nursed her by the fire, rocking slowly in the handmade chair. The house was warm now, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows. Outside, she could hear cattle lowing and the distant sound of men's voices. This could be peaceful, she thought. This could be a life, if she could trust it. If she could believe it would last. Evening came early in the winter mountains. The sun disappeared behind the peaks, and shadows flooded the valley. Sarah had managed to prepare a simple meal, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy, and it was warming on the stove when Daniel returned. He came through the door on a blast of cold air, his face reddened from wind, snow clinging to his shoulders. He stopped when he saw the table set for 2, the food ready. "You didn't have to cook," he said. "You're paying me to keep house," Sarah replied. "That includes cooking." Daniel hung his coat and hat by the door, then moved to the pump to wash his hands. "Carlos and Miguel usually eat in the bunkhouse. They've got their own setup there." "I made enough for 4, Sarah said. "Should I take some out to them?" "They'd appreciate that, but you don't have to wait on them." "I'm not waiting on anyone. I'm earning my wages." Something flickered in Daniel's expression. Approval, maybe, or respect. But it was gone before Sarah could be sure. He dried his hands and sat at the table. They ate in silence. Sarah had never been comfortable with quiet, had always felt compelled to fill it with conversation. But Daniel seemed perfectly content to eat without talking, and Grace was asleep in the cradle. And Sarah found she didn't mind the silence as much as she'd expected. "How was the herd?" she asked finally. "Lost 2 calves to the storm." Daniel's voice was matter of fact. "Found them frozen in a drift. Could have been worse. Rest came through fine." "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "It's the life. You lose stock sometimes." Sarah thought about those 2 dead calves, about the money they represented. Money Daniel might not have lost if he hadn't spent $150 at an auction. "Are you?" She stopped herself. "Am I what?" "Are you going to regret it?" The words came out in a rush. "Buying me, spending that money. Are you going to wake up one day and realize you made a terrible mistake? Daniel set down his fork. He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd returned to the ranch. No, he said. I won't regret it. How can you be sure? Because I know why I did it. He leaned back in his chair, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A choice that cost you half your savings and 2 calves you might have saved if you'd been here during the storm instead of riding to Caribou Creek. Maybe, Daniel's voice stayed level, or maybe I'd have lost 4 calves, or none. There's no way to know. He paused. But I do know that if I hadn't gone to that courthouse, you and Grace would be somewhere far worse tonight. So no, Sarah, I don't regret it. Sarah looked down at her plate. I don't understand you. You don't have to. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Daniel stood and carried his plate to the wash basin. I'm going to check the animals one more time before bed. Lock the door behind me. He was gone before Sarah could respond. She sat at the table, Grace's soft breathing the only sound in the empty house, and tried to make sense of Daniel Frost. He'd saved her, spent a fortune on her, given her work and wages and a home. And now he was sleeping in the barn, avoiding her eyes, and treating her like a business arrangement instead of a woman he'd rescued. Sarah cleared the dishes and banked the fire. She checked that the door was locked, though who she was locking out in the middle of nowhere, she couldn't say, and retreated to the bedroom with Grace. The cradle sat by the bed, beautiful and heartbreaking. Sarah laid Grace in it and watched her daughter sleep for a long moment. Then she changed into the nightgown Mrs. Henderson had given her and climbed under the quilt. The bed was soft, the room was warm. Grace was safe and fed and sleeping peacefully. By any measure, this was better than the boarding house in Caribou Creek, better than the courthouse floor, better than anything Sarah had dared hope for yesterday morning. So why did she feel so unsettled, so uncertain? Because kindness without explanation felt like a trap. Because rescue without conditions felt too good to be true. Because Daniel Frost was an enigma she couldn't solve, and Sarah had learned the hard way that men were dangerous when you couldn't predict them. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frames. The fire in the main room crackled and popped, and somewhere in the darkness, Daniel Frost bedded down in the barn, alone in the cold. The pattern held for 3 days. Daniel left at dawn with Carlos and Miguel. Sarah kept the house, cooked meals, tended the chickens, and tried to make herself useful. Daniel returned at dusk, ate dinner in silence, then disappeared to the barn or the bunkhouse. They spoke only when necessary, practical words about supplies needed or work completed. Grace was the only brightness. The baby seemed to thrive in the warm house, away from the stress and cold of the boarding house. She smiled more, fussed less. Sarah found herself singing to her daughter as she worked, old songs from her own childhood, half-forgotten melodies that surfaced from memory. On the 4th morning, Sarah woke to find fresh snow falling, not a blizzard, like the storm that had driven them to the Hendersons, but a steady, heavy fall that blanketed everything in white. She made coffee and cornmeal mush, expecting Daniel to come in for breakfast before riding out, but the door stayed closed. The house stayed quiet. Sarah waited an hour, then 2. Finally, worried, she bundled Grace against her chest, pulled on Daniel's sheepskin coat, he'd never asked for it back, and stepped outside. The cold bit at her face. The world was muffled by falling snow, everything soft and distant. Sarah made her way to the barn, her boots sinking into drifts. Inside, the barn was dim and warm, heated by the bodies of horses and the 2 milk cows Daniel kept. Carlos and Miguel's voices came from the back stalls, speaking rapid Spanish. Sarah followed the sound. She found Daniel in Buck's stall, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold, his face pale. He was leaning heavily against the horse, one hand pressed to his left side. "Daniel." Sarah's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. He looked up, surprise, and something else, anger maybe, or embarrassment, crossing his face. "I told you to stay in the house," he said. "You didn't come for breakfast. I was worried." Sarah moved closer. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, just—" He winced as he tried to straighten up. "Pulled something yesterday. It's fine." "It's not fine. You can barely stand." Sarah turned toward the back of the barn. "Carlos, Miguel." The 2 men appeared quickly, concern on their faces. They took in the situation at a glance. "How long has he been like this?" Sarah asked. "Since yesterday afternoon," Carlos admitted. "He's been working through it, but nothing," Sarah snapped. She turned back to Daniel. "You're coming to the house. Now." "Sarah, I'm not arguing with you. You're injured, and you need rest. Carlos, help him." Daniel started to protest again, but Carlos was already moving to his side, supporting him with one strong arm. Miguel went ahead to open the barn door. Sarah followed as they half-carried Daniel through the snow to the house. Inside, she pointed to the rocking chair by the fire. "Sit." Daniel sat, his jaw tight with pain, or pride, or both. Sarah handed Grace to Miguel, who looked terrified, but held the baby carefully, and turned back to Daniel. "Shirt off," she said. "That's not—" "You can take it off yourself, or I can cut it off. Choose." Daniel's eyes flashed, but he unbuttoned his shirt with slow, careful movements. When he pulled it away, Sarah's breath caught. His left side was a mass of purple and black bruising, spreading from his ribs to his hip. The skin was hot to the touch, swollen and angry. "What happened?" Sarah demanded. "Got kicked," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "One of the calves, day before yesterday. It's just bruising." "Just bruising?" Sarah knelt beside the chair. "You could have broken ribs, internal bleeding. What were you thinking, working like this?" "Work doesn't stop because I'm sore. Work stops when you can't breathe without passing out." Sarah looked up at Carlos and Miguel. "Get some snow, clean snow, in a basin, and find cloth for compresses." The men hurried to obey. Sarah turned back to Daniel. His face was pale now, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold that had clung to him from outside. "This is stupid," she said quietly. "You're being stupid. I've been hurt worse. That doesn't make this smart." Sarah's hands hovered over the bruising, afraid to touch it. "You should see a doctor." "Nearest doctor is in Caribou Creek. That's a day's ride in this weather." "Then what do I do?" Daniel met her eyes. For the first time since the Henderson cabin, his expression was unguarded. "You do what you're doing. Cold compresses to bring down the swelling. Make sure I keep breathing even. Watch for fever." He paused. "And you tell me if I'm being an idiot about this." "You're being an idiot about this." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Noted." Carlos returned with the snow and cloth. Sarah made compresses and laid them gently against Daniel's side. He flinched, but didn't pull away. Miguel brought Grace back, and Sarah settled the baby in the cradle where she could watch her while she worked. "You two go tend the animals," Sarah said to Carlos and Miguel. I'll stay with him. Ma'am, if you need anything, Carlos started. I'll fire the shotgun. You'll come running, I know. Sarah looked up at them. Thank you for helping him, for being honest with me. They left, pulling their hats low. The door closed behind them, and Sarah was alone with Daniel and the baby. She changed the compresses every 20 minutes, kept the fire high, made strong coffee that Daniel drank without complaint. He didn't try to get up or go back to work. He just sat in the rocking chair, eyes closed, breathing carefully. Why didn't you tell me you were hurt? Sarah asked after an hour of silence. Didn't want you to worry. I'm your housekeeper. Part of keeping house is making sure the man who owns it doesn't kill himself being stubborn. Daniel's eyes opened. Is that all you are? My housekeeper? Sarah's hands stilled on the compress. What else would I be? I don't know. His voice was quiet. I've been trying to figure that out for 4 days. You're the one who set the terms. $20 a month, room and board, domestic work. I know what I said. Daniel shifted in the chair, then winced. But it doesn't feel right. You're not staff, Sarah. You're not an employee. Then what am I? He was quiet for a long time. You're someone I'm trying not to fail. Sarah sat back on her heels. What does that mean? It means... Daniel stopped, choosing his words carefully. It means I bought you at an auction, and that makes me responsible for you, whether you like it or not. It means I promised you choices and safety, and I meant it. But it also means I don't know how to act around you, because everything I do feels wrong somehow. Wrong how? If I'm friendly, it feels like I'm expecting something from you. If I'm distant, it feels like I'm treating you like property. If I try to help, you push back. If I give you space, you think I regret bringing you here. He met her eyes. I can't win, Sarah. So I've been trying to just do the work, keep the ranch running, give you time to figure out what you need without me hovering. Sarah stared at him. You could have just asked me what I needed. Could I? Daniel's voice held an edge now. Because every time I try to talk to you, you look at me like I'm about to hurt you, like I'm one wrong move away from turning into every other man who's failed you. The words hit like a slap. Sarah stood abruptly, the compress falling from her hands. That's not fair, she said. Maybe not, but it's true. You don't know anything about me, about what I've been through. You're right, I don't. Daniel leaned his head back against the chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. And you don't know anything about me either. We're two strangers trying to figure out how to live under the same roof without destroying each other. It's not easy for either of us. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. Grace had started fussing in the cradle, working up to a cry. Sarah picked her up automatically, holding her daughter like a shield. I'm trying, she said quietly. I'm trying to trust you, but trust isn't something I have a lot of left to give. I know, Daniel's voice softened, and I'm not asking for it, not yet. I'm just asking you to stop waiting for me to become a monster, because I'm not going to, Sarah, no matter how long you wait. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, at the pain in his face, the bruising on his side, the exhaustion in his eyes. At this man who'd spent a fortune to save her, who'd ridden through a blizzard for a woman he didn't know, who'd built a cradle in the middle of the night and filled drawers with space for clothes she didn't own. All right, she said, I'll try. That's all I'm asking. They settled into an uneasy truce after that. Sarah kept the compresses coming. Daniel drank the willow bark tea she brewed for pain. Grace nursed and dozed and woke again. The snow continued falling outside, soft and relentless. By evening, the swelling in Daniel's side had gone down slightly, and his color was better. He insisted on moving to the table for dinner, though Sarah could see each movement cost him. "You should sleep in the bed tonight," Sarah said as they ate. "I'll take the rocking chair." "No," Daniel said. "The bed is yours. I'm fine in the barn." "You're injured. You need rest and warmth, not a frozen barn." "I'll sleep by the fire then." "Why are you being stubborn about this?" "Because you need privacy. You need space that's yours alone." Daniel's voice was firm. "I won't take that from you." "What I need," Sarah said quietly, "is for you to stop treating me like I'm made of glass. I've survived worse than sharing a house with a man who has broken ribs. I can handle you sleeping by the fire." Daniel studied her face. "All right, but if you're uncomfortable at any point, you tell me. No arguments." "Deal." That night, Sarah helped Daniel settle on a pallet by the fire. She brought him extra blankets and made sure the wood was stacked close enough that he could reach it without getting up. Grace was already asleep in the cradle in the bedroom, and Sarah found herself reluctant to leave the main room. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, "thank you for today, for taking care of me." "You're paying me to keep house," she replied. "That includes keeping you alive." "Even so, thank you." Sarah nodded and retreated to the bedroom, but she left the door open a crack, just enough that she could hear Daniel's breathing, slow and even in the darkness. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the fire crackle and the wind howl outside, thinking about Daniel's words, about trust and monsters and trying. Somewhere in the night, Grace woke crying. Sarah stumbled from bed to soothe her, and when she emerged from the bedroom, she found Daniel trying to sit up, his face creased with concern. "Just the baby," Sarah said quickly. "Go back to sleep." But Daniel was already up, moving slowly to the fire to add wood. "I'm awake anyway. Bring her out here. It's warmer." So Sarah sat in the rocking chair with Grace, and Daniel tended the fire, and they spent an hour in the deep night together, not speaking, just existing in the same space. It wasn't comfort, exactly. It wasn't peace, but it was something. A beginning, maybe. A small crack in the walls they'd both built. And when Grace finally settled back to sleep, and Sarah returned to her bed, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Daniel, at least. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was everything. Something. A beginning, maybe. A small crack in the walls they'd both built. And when Grace finally settled back to sleep, and Sarah returned to her bed, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Daniel, at least. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was everything. Daniel healed slowly over the next week. The bruising faded from black to purple to yellow-green, and his breathing came easier. Sarah watched him carefully, noting when he moved too quickly, or when pain flashed across his face before he could hide it. She'd started trusting her instincts about him. And those instincts said he'd push himself too hard if she didn't intervene. "You're hovering," Daniel said one morning as Sarah refilled his coffee for the third time. "I'm making sure you don't collapse and crack your skull open," Sarah replied. "That's different." Carlos laughed from his seat at the table. He and Miguel had taken to eating breakfast in the main house now, a shift that had happened naturally after Daniel's injury. Sarah didn't mind. Their presence made the house feel less isolated. less like she and Daniel were tiptoeing around something neither could name. "She's worse than my mother," Miguel said to Daniel. "You should just give in now. Save yourself the trouble." "Your mother was a smart woman," Sarah said. "She knew stubborn men need managing." "Yes, ma'am," Miguel grinned. "That's what she always said." The easy banter felt good, normal. Sarah had forgotten what normal felt like. People gathered around a table, sharing a meal and conversation without tension crackling underneath. Grace seemed to sense it too. She'd started making happy noises from her cradle, responding to voices with coos and gurgles. "Someone's awake," Carlos said. He stood and peered into the bedroom where the cradle sat. "Can I hold her, ma'am?" Sarah's first instinct was to say no, to keep Grace close and protected. But Carlos's face held only gentle interest, and she remembered Mrs. Henderson's words about Daniel being a good man. He'd chosen these two to work for him. That had to mean something. "Support her head," Sarah said, "and sit down first. She's getting heavy." Carlos settled into the rocking chair with Grace in his arms, his big hands surprisingly gentle. Miguel moved to stand behind him, making faces at the baby until she smiled. "She's beautiful," Carlos said, "like her mama." Sarah felt her face heat. She turned away, busying herself with the dishes. When she glanced back, Daniel was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. The moment broke when someone knocked on the door. Everyone froze. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially in winter. Daniel stood slowly, his hand moving automatically toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Carlos, take the baby to the bedroom," Daniel said quietly. "Sarah, go with him." "Daniel," Sarah started, "just do it, please." Something in his voice made Sarah obey. She took Grace from Carlos and hurried into the bedroom. Carlos followed, but stayed in the doorway, his body positioned between Sarah and the main room. Miguel had moved to the window, peering out carefully. "It's a wagon," Miguel said. "2 horses, 1 driver." "You recognize him?" Daniel asked. "No, boss, but he's alone." Daniel relaxed slightly, but didn't move away from the rifle. "All right, I'll talk to him. You two stay ready." He opened the door. Cold air rushed in along with a man's voice. "Mr. Frost, name's William Chen. I'm looking for my wife's friend, Sarah Brennan. Heard she might be here." Sarah's breath caught. Chen, Mrs. Chen from the courthouse. The lady who tried to stop the auction. She pushed past Carlos before he could stop her. "Mr. Chen." She appeared in the doorway beside Daniel. "Is Mrs. Chen all right?" The man on the porch was small and weathered with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His face broke into a smile of relief when he saw Sarah. "She's fine, Mrs. Brennan. Worried about you, though. Sent me to check that you were safe." His eyes moved to Daniel. "Mr. Frost, I presume." "That's right." Daniel's voice was cautious. "You came 20 miles in this weather to check on Mrs. Brennan?" "My wife hasn't slept properly since the auction. She feels responsible, like she should have done more to stop it." Mr. Chen stamped his feet against the cold. "She made me promise to see with my own eyes that Mrs. Brennan and the baby were being treated well." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Mrs. Chen, who barely had enough to feed her own children, had sent her husband through the snow out of guilt and concern. "Come in," Sarah said. "Please have some coffee." Mr. Chen entered, removing his hat. His eyes took in the warm house, the breakfast dishes still on the table, Carlos and Miguel standing protectively near the bedroom door. His gaze lingered on Sarah, assessing. "You look better than you did at the courthouse," he said finally. "Less afraid." "I am better," Sarah said. "Mr. Frost has been kind enough to let you answer questions alone." Mr. Chen looked at Daniel. "No offense meant, sir, but my wife needs to know the truth." Daniel nodded slowly. "Sarah, do you want to talk to Mr. Chen privately?" The fact that he asked, that he gave her the choice, made Sarah's answer easier. "No, there's nothing to hide. Mr. Frost bought me at auction to save me from worse fates. He's given me work and wages and treated me with respect. Your wife can rest easy." "You're sure?" Mr. Chen pressed. "Because if you need help, if you need a way out, I don't." Sarah surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is where I want to be, at least for now." Mr. Chen studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. I believe you." He turned to Daniel. "My wife asked me to give you something, Mr. Frost. Payment, she called it, though she knows you don't need it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. When he unwrapped it, Sarah saw bread still warm and a jar of preserved peaches. She said any man who'd spend his savings to stop that auction deserved. "Thanks," Mr. Chen said. "And she wanted Mrs. Brennan to know she has friends in Caribou Creek. If you ever need anything, our door is open." Sarah took the bundle with shaking hands. "Tell her thank you. Tell her," her voice broke. "Tell her I'll never forget what she tried to do." Mr. Chen smiled. "I will. She'll be glad to hear you're safe." He pulled his hat back on. "I should go. Got a long ride back." "Stay for breakfast at least," Sarah said. "And take some supplies for your wife, please." They fed Mr. Chen and loaded his wagon with flour, salt, pork, and dried beans. Daniel insisted, ignoring Sarah's protests about the cost. When the man finally left, promising to tell his wife everything he'd seen, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the wagon disappear into the trees. "That was kind of you," she said to Daniel, "giving him those supplies. Mrs. Chen tried to help you when no one else would. Make sure she eats well this winter." Sarah turned to look at him. "You're a strange man, Daniel Frost." "So you keep telling me." "I mean it as a compliment." "I know." He smiled. A real smile this time, not the careful half expression he usually wore. "Come on, we've got work to do." The days settled into routine after that. Daniel's ribs healed enough for him to return to light work, though Sarah still caught him wincing when he thought no one was watching. Carlos and Miguel continued eating breakfast in the main house, and slowly, carefully, the four of them became something like a family. Grace thrived. She was 4 months old now, growing longer and heavier, her eyes focusing on faces with clear recognition. She smiled when Carlos made his silly faces and kicked her legs when Miguel sang Spanish lullabies. And when Daniel held her, which he did more often now, at Sarah's encouragement, she would grip his finger with surprising strength and stare up at him with solemn trust. "She likes you," Sarah said one evening, watching Daniel walk Grace around the main room to soothe her fussing. "She's a good baby," Daniel replied. "Easy to like." "That's not what I meant." Daniel looked at her over Grace's small head. "I know what you meant." Sarah felt heat rise in her face and turned back to the mending in her lap. These moments were happening more frequently, charged silences where something unspoken hung between them. Sarah didn't know what to do with them. Part of her wanted to push, to force whatever this was into the open. Another part wanted to leave it alone, afraid that naming it would destroy it. The decision was taken from her hands 3 days later, when riders appeared on the northern ridge. Miguel saw them first. He was hauling firewood to the house when he stopped and shaded his eyes, looking toward the tree line. "Boss," he called. "Company." Daniel emerged from the barn, followed by Carlos. Sarah came to the door with Grace in her arms. They all watched as 3 horses picked their way down the snow-covered slope. "You expecting anyone?" Carlos asked. "No." Daniel's voice had gone flat. "Sarah, get inside. Take the baby and lock the door." "Who are they?" "Don't know, but 3 men riding together this far from town usually means trouble." He turned to her, his expression urgent. "Please, just do as I ask." Sarah wanted to argue, but the tension in Daniel's shoulders stopped her. She retreated inside and locked the door, then moved to the window where she could see without being easily seen. The riders reached the ranch yard. They were rough-looking men, hard faces, heavy coats, guns visible on their hips. The leader was tall and broad, with a thick beard going gray. He dismounted and walked toward Daniel with the easy confidence of a man used to getting his way. "Well now," the bearded man said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Daniel Frost. Been a long time." "Not long enough, Garrett." Daniel's voice was ice. "What do you want?" "Heard you had yourself some excitement in Caribou Creek. Bought a woman at auction." Garrett's eyes swept the ranch. "That true?" "My business is my own." "See, that's where you're wrong." Garrett smiled, showing yellow teeth. "When a man pays good money for property, that becomes everybody's business, especially when that property used to belong to Harold Brennan." Sarah's blood went cold. Used to belong to, as if she were furniture. "Mrs. Brennan is under my protection," Daniel said, "and you need to leave now." "Protection." Garrett laughed. "That what they're calling it these days?" He turned to his companions. "You hear that, boys? Frost's protecting her." The other men laughed. Carlos and Miguel had moved to flank Daniel, their hands near their weapons. The tension ratcheted higher. "I said leave," Daniel repeated. "Can't do that." Garrett's smile faded. "See, Harold Brennan owed me money, gambling debts. And when a man dies with debts unpaid, those debts pass to his property. That means everything Harold owned, including his daughter-in-law, belongs to me until the debt's satisfied." "That's not how the law works," Daniel said. "Law says what Judge Morrison says it says. And Judge Morrison happens to owe me a favor or two." Garrett pulled a paper from his coat. "Got a writ signed by the judge himself. Says I have legal claim to anything sold from Harold Brennan's estate. That includes one Sarah Brennan and her infant." Sarah's legs nearly gave out. This couldn't be happening. Not again. "Let me see that," Daniel said. Garrett handed over the paper. Daniel read it, his face going progressively darker. When he looked up, fury burned in his eyes. This is fraud, pure fraud. Judge Morrison can't just reassign legal ownership after a concluded sale. "Can he?" Garrett grinned. "Way I see it, you paid Morrison for the woman. I paid Morrison for the right to collect on Brennan's debts. Judge says my claim predates yours, so either you hand her over or you pay me what Brennan owed. Your choice." "How much?" $300. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. $300, twice what Daniel had paid at the auction, more than most men made in a year. "You know I don't have that kind of money," Daniel said quietly. "Then I guess we'll be taking the woman." Garrett nodded toward the house. "Unless you want to negotiate some other arrangement. Pretty thing like her could work off the debt in other ways." Daniel's fist caught Garrett in the jaw before the man could finish. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Daniel's injured ribs forgotten in rage. Carlos and Miguel jumped forward, but the other two riders had drawn their guns. "Stay back," one of them warned. "This is between Garrett and Frost." Sarah watched in horror as Daniel and Garrett fought in the snow. Daniel was younger and faster, but Garrett was heavier and willing to fight dirty. He landed a blow to Daniel's injured side that made Daniel gasp and stumble. Garrett used the opening to pin Daniel against the barn wall, one meaty hand around his throat. "Now you listen to me," Garrett snarled. "I don't care if you think you're protecting her. I don't care about your noble intentions. She's property, and I have legal claim. So you can hand her over peaceable-like, or I can take her. Your choice." Daniel's hand scrabbled in the snow. It closed around a loose board, one of the fence rails damaged in the storm. He swung it hard, catching Garrett across the temple. The bigger man staggered back, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "She's not property," Daniel gasped, clutching his side. "She's a human being, and you don't touch her." Garrett wiped blood from his face. "You just assaulted me, Frost. That's a crime. I could have you arrested." "Do it." Daniel straightened up despite the pain. "I'll tell Judge Morrison exactly what you tried to do here. Let's see whose story he believes." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Garrett smiled, slow and ugly. "This ain't over. That writ is legal, and you know it. I'll be back with the sheriff, and when I come, you'll hand her over or spend the rest of your life in jail for kidnapping." He mounted his horse, his companions following suit. "You've got 3 days to come up with the money, Frost. After that, she's mine." They rode off, leaving Daniel standing in the trampled snow, blood on his knuckles and fury in his eyes. Sarah unlocked the door and ran to him. "Are you all right?" "Fine." But he wasn't fine. He was shaking with rage, or pain, or both. "We need to talk inside." In the house, Carlos poured whiskey, while Sarah examined Daniel's face. The cut on his cheekbone wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely. His ribs were another story. She could see him struggling to breathe without showing how much it hurt. "Lie down," she ordered. "No time. We need a plan." "Daniel, Sarah." He grabbed her hand, stopping her fussing. "Listen to me. Garrett's writ might be fraudulent, but it's also legal enough to cause problems. Judge Morrison is corrupt, and everyone knows it. If Garrett brings the sheriff back, things could go bad fast. So what do we do?" Daniel looked at Carlos and Miguel. "How much do we have in the bank?" "About $70, Carlos said. "Plus the money from the cattle we sold last fall, another 80, but that's earmarked for spring supplies. So, 150 total." Daniel did the math in his head. "Half of what we need." "I have $20, Sarah said. "My wages that you've been paying me. Take it." "No." Daniel shook his head. "This is my problem. Let me help solve it. It's not your problem. It's mine." Daniel stood and paced to the window, favoring his injured side. "I bought you at that auction. That makes you my responsibility." "I'm not your responsibility," Sarah said sharply. "I'm not your anything. Stop acting like you own me just because you paid money for me." Daniel turned to face her. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're making decisions about my life without consulting me, just like every other man I've ever known." The words hit like a slap. Daniel flinched. "You're right. I'm sorry. What do you want to do?" Sarah looked down at Grace in her arms, at her daughter's innocent face, unaware of the danger surrounding them. Then she looked back at Daniel. "I want to fight," she said quietly. "I want to stand up and say no. No more auctions, no more being sold, no more men deciding my fate." Her voice strengthened. "But I also want Grace to be safe, and if the only way to guarantee that is to give Garrett what he wants." "No." Daniel crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. "You are not giving him anything. We're going to figure this out." "How?" "You don't have the money." "Then I'll get it. I'll sell cattle. I'll take out a loan. He stopped, something shifting in his expression. "Wait, there might be another way." "What way?" Daniel turned to Carlos and Miguel. "You two still have contacts in Denver, people who might be interested in buying horses?" "See," Miguel said slowly. "But boss, it's the middle of winter. No one's buying horses now. They will if the price is right, and if the horses are good enough." Daniel's mind was clearly racing ahead. "We've got 8 saddle horses, including Buck. If we sold 6 of them at $20 each..." "That's only 120, Carlos pointed out. "Still not enough. Plus the 150 we have, that's 270. Close." "Not close enough," Sarah said. "And Daniel, you can't sell your horses. You need them for the ranch." "I need you and Grace safe, more than I need horses." Daniel's voice was firm. "We'll make it work. We always do." "There is another option," Sarah said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "I could go with Garrett, work off the debt. Maybe he'd accept that instead of money." "Absolutely not." Daniel's voice cracked like a whip. "Sarah, do you understand what he meant when he said you could work off the debt in other ways? Do you understand what men like Garrett do to women in your position?" "I understand perfectly." Sarah's hands tightened on Grace. "I understood it at the courthouse when Dutch Hansen bid on me. I understood it in that boarding house when Mrs. Patterson looked at me like I was livestock. I've understood it my whole life, Daniel. Women always understand." The room fell silent. Carlos and Miguel looked at the floor, uncomfortable. Daniel's face had gone pale. "Then you know why that's not an option," he said finally. "I know it's the only option that doesn't destroy everything you've built here." Sarah forced herself to meet his eyes. "You can't sacrifice the ranch for me. It's not worth it." "You are worth it." Daniel's voice was rough. "You and Grace are worth more than all of this combined." "That's not your decision to make." "Yes, it is. Because I'm the one who brought you here. I'm the one who promised you'd be safe, and I'm not breaking that promise." He turned back to Carlos and Miguel. "Ride to Denver tomorrow. Find buyers for the horses. Tell them I need cash by end of week, and I'll sell at whatever price they offer." "Boss," Carlos started. "Just do it, please." The brothers exchanged glances, then nodded. "We'll leave at first light," Miguel said. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with Grace beside her, listening to Daniel moving restlessly in the main room. The house felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in. Outside, wind howled through the trees, another storm building. Finally, unable to stand it anymore, Sarah rose and went to the door. She opened it a crack and saw Daniel sitting at the table, his head in his hands. "You should be sleeping," she said. He looked up. "So should you." "Can't." Sarah stepped fully into the room, closing the door softly behind her. "Daniel, you can't sell your horses. This ranch is your livelihood. Without horses, you can't work. Cattle can't travel. Can't watch Garrett take you away, knowing I could have stopped it. Daniel stood. Sarah, I know you think I'm making this decision for you, but I'm not. I'm making it for me because I can't live with the alternative. Why? The question burst from Sarah before she could stop it. Why do you care so much? I'm just a woman you bought at an auction. You barely know me. That's not true, isn't it? We've lived under the same roof for 2 weeks. We're polite strangers at best. Daniel crossed to stand in front of her. This close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the worry lines around his eyes. I know you sing to grace when you think no one's listening, he said quietly. Old songs in a language I don't recognize. I know you can't sleep when the wind blows hard because it reminds you of something bad. I know you check the door locks 3 times every night. I know you're terrified of being touched, but you let Carlos hold your baby because you recognized he needed to feel useful. Sarah's breath caught. I know you're stronger than you think you are, Daniel continued, braver than any woman I've ever met. And I know that if Garrett takes you, something in this world that deserves to survive won't. He paused. So no, Sarah, we're not strangers. Not anymore. Daniel. Sarah's voice broke. He stepped back quickly. I'm sorry. That was too much. I shouldn't have. Sarah grabbed his hand before he could retreat further. Don't apologize. Just tell me what you want from me. From this. Because I can't keep guessing and getting it wrong. Daniel looked down at their joined hands. I want you to stay. I want Grace to grow up here safe and loved. I want to build something with you, not because I own you or because you owe me, but because we choose it, both of us. He met her eyes. But only if that's what you want too. I don't know what I want, Sarah admitted. Everything's happened so fast. The auction, coming here, Garrett showing up. I can't think straight. Then don't think, just feel. What do you feel when you're here, in this house, on this ranch? Sarah closed her eyes. What did she feel? Safe, for the first time in months. Warm, fed, like maybe, possibly, she could breathe again. I feel like I could stay, she whispered. If you're really asking if you really mean it. I mean it. Daniel's hand tightened on hers. I've never meant anything more. They stood there in the firelight, hands joined, something fragile and new forming between them. Outside, the storm broke fully, wind driving snow against the windows. But inside, the house stayed warm. And for the first time since Thomas died, Sarah let herself hope that maybe the future didn't have to be something she survived. Maybe it could be something she chose. Even if that choice came with complications. Even if Garrett returned in 3 days, demanding payment or blood. Even if everything fell apart tomorrow. Tonight, standing in Daniel Frost's kitchen with her hand in his, Sarah chose hope. And that, she was learning, was its own kind of bravery. Carlos and Miguel left before sunrise, their saddlebags packed with enough supplies for the hard ride to Denver. Sarah watched from the window as they led 6 horses, including Buck, Daniel's favorite, into the pre-dawn darkness. Daniel stood in the yard until they disappeared into the trees, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he came back inside, his face was carefully blank. They'll get good prices, Sarah said, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. Maybe. Daniel moved to the stove and poured coffee with steady hands. We'll know in 2 days. 2 days. Garrett had given them 3 before he'd return with the sheriff. The timing would be close. Too close. Sarah fed Grace and tried to keep busy with normal tasks. Washing dishes, sweeping floors, checking the chickens. But the house felt wrong without Carlos and Miguel's voices, without the easy routine they'd established. Everything felt suspended, waiting. Daniel spent the day doing work that didn't need doing, repairing fence rails that weren't broken, reorganizing the barn, chopping enough firewood to last through 2 winters. Sarah recognized the behavior. She'd done the same thing after Thomas died. Scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending clothes that had no holes. Work was easier than thinking. By evening they were both exhausted, but neither wanted to sleep. They sat at the table with cold supper. Neither had appetite for it, the silence heavy between them. "Tell me about Thomas," Daniel said finally. Sarah looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because you loved him. Because he's Grace's father. Because I want to know." Daniel pushed food around his plate. "If that's all right." Sarah set down her fork. No one had asked about Thomas since he died. Not Mrs. Patterson, not the creditors, not Judge Morrison. It was as if her husband had been erased, along with her rights. "He was kind," she said slowly. "Quiet. He loved books and numbers. Said they made sense in ways people didn't. We met at my father's store in Boston. Thomas came in looking for a ledger, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important." She smiled at the memory. "He proposed 3 months later." "Were you happy?" "I thought so. We had a good life in St. Louis. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. Thomas worked hard, and I kept house, and we talked about having children someday." Her hand moved unconsciously to Grace's cradle, where the baby slept. "Then I got pregnant, and everything changed." "How?" Thomas was terrified. Kept talking about money, about responsibility, about what if something went wrong. His mother died in childbirth, and I think he never got over it. Sarah's voice softened. "When Grace was born, he held her for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Then he handed her back and said he had to go check the accounts at his office." "He was scared," Daniel said quietly. "I know, but I was scared too, and I didn't have the luxury of walking away." Sarah looked at Daniel. He died 3 weeks later. Never really got to know his daughter. I don't even know if he would have, given time, if he would have learned to love her the way she deserved. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Thomas was a good man, but he wasn't a strong one." When his father started gambling, Thomas knew, but didn't stop it. When the debts piled up, he ignored them. He was good at ignoring things that scared him. She paused. "You're not like that." "How do you know?" "Because you rode through a blizzard to stop an auction. Because you're selling your horses to protect people you barely know. Because you don't walk away when things get hard." Sarah met his eyes. "You're nothing like Thomas, Daniel. Nothing at all." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sound from outside cut him off. Horses, approaching, fast. They both stood. Daniel grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. Sarah's heart hammered. It was too early for Carlos and Miguel to be back, which meant, "It's not Garrett," Daniel said. "Just one rider coming hard." He opened the door. A moment later, Mr. Chen stumbled into the house, his face gray with cold and exhaustion. "Thank God," he gasped. "I rode straight through. Had to warn you." "Warn us about what?" Daniel steadied the older man into a chair. Sarah was already pouring hot coffee. "Garrett!" Mr. Chen wrapped his hands around the cup, trying to stop their shaking. "He came to Caribou Creek yesterday. Started asking questions about you, Mrs. Brennan, About Mr. Frost. About the auction. What kind of questions? Sarah asked. About witnesses. About who was there. Who saw what happened. He's building a case, trying to prove the sale was invalid somehow. Mr. Chen looked at Daniel. He's also been talking to Dutch Hansen and Frank Cooper, the men who bid against you, offering them money to testify that you threatened them, that you forced them to stop bidding. That's a lie, Sarah said. I know that. You know that. But Judge Morrison, Mr. Chen shook his head. He'll believe whatever Garrett pays him to believe. Daniel's jaw tightened. How much time do we have? Garrett's gathering his witnesses today. He plans to bring them here tomorrow, along with the sheriff. He's going to claim you kidnapped Mrs. Brennan, that the auction was invalid, that she belongs to him as Harold Brennan's creditor. Mr. Chen looked at Sarah. I'm sorry. My wife sent me as soon as we heard. Thank you, Sarah whispered, for risking the ride. There's more. Mr. Chen hesitated. Garrett's also been asking about you, Mr. Frost, about your past, your family. He found out about Martha and what happened to her. Daniel went very still. What about Martha? He's planning to use it against you. Say you have a habit of taking in women inappropriately, that you can't be trusted. He's going to paint you as... Mr. Chen stopped, his face flushing, as someone with improper intentions toward Mrs. Brennan. The room fell silent. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, hot and clean and clarifying. So, that's his plan, she said. Destroy Daniel's reputation and take me at the same time. It's a smart plan, Daniel said quietly. If Judge Morrison rules the auction invalid and gives Garrett custody, there's nothing I can do legally. I'd be the one breaking the law if I tried to stop him. Then we don't fight it legally. Sarah surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. We fight it another way. Both men turned to look at her. Grace stirred in her cradle, but didn't wake. What do you mean? Daniel asked. I mean Garrett's entire case rests on me being property. Harold Brennan's property passed to his creditors, which means I can be claimed and transferred like furniture. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. But what if I'm not Harold Brennan's property anymore? What if I belong to someone else legally? Sarah, Daniel started, marry me. The words came out in a rush. Right now, tonight. If I'm your wife, legally married, properly witnessed, then Garrett has no claim. I'm not Harold Brennan's anything. I'm Sarah Frost. Daniel stared at her. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. It's the only way. Sarah, marriage isn't something you do out of desperation. It's a legal contract, Sarah interrupted. That's all marriage is, really. A legal arrangement between two people. You said yourself you wanted me to stay, wanted to build something with me. So let's build it, starting now. This isn't how it should happen. Daniel's voice was rough. You deserve better than a desperate marriage to avoid a legal trap. What I deserve is to choose my own fate. Sarah moved closer to him. You told me I'd have choices here. This is me choosing. I'm choosing you, Daniel. I'm choosing this life, this ranch, this future. Not because I'm forced to, but because it's what I want. You don't know what you want. You're scared. And Garrett's threatening you, and don't tell me what I feel. Sarah's voice sharpened. I've had enough men telling me what I think and feel and want. I'm telling you right now, clearly, with witnesses, she gestured to Mr. Chen, that I want to marry you. The question is whether you want to marry me. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Sarah could see the war in his eyes, desire fighting with honor, hope fighting with doubt. I want to, he said finally. God help me. I want to, but not like this. Not with you feeling trapped into it. I don't feel trapped. I feel free. Sarah took his hand. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I'm making a real choice. Please don't take that away from me. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I think Mrs. Brennan is right. A legal marriage would complicate Garrett's claim significantly. He'd have to prove the marriage was fraudulent, which would take time and money. See? Sarah squeezed Daniel's hand. It's the smart choice. It's insane, Daniel said. But he was smiling slightly. You want to get married right now, in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, with Garrett threatening to show up tomorrow. Yes. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Daniel looked down at their joined hands. When he looked up again, something had settled in his expression, a decision made. All right, he said. Let's get married. Mr. Chen stood. I can witness, and my wife will testify to it if needed, but you'll need someone to perform the ceremony. The nearest preacher is in Caribou Creek. We can't go there, Daniel said. Garrett's people are watching. Then we bring the preacher here. Sarah turned to Mr. Chen. Reverend Douglas, the one who runs the Sunday services at the schoolhouse, would he come at night in this weather? Mr. Chen considered. For you, Mrs. Brennan, and to stop what Garrett's trying to do? Yes, I think he would. Then go, Sarah said. Please bring him back before morning. Mr. Chen nodded and headed for the door, pausing only to gulp down the rest of his coffee. I'll be back in 3 hours, 4 at most. He looked at Daniel. Keep her safe until then. I will, Daniel promised. After Mr. Chen left, the house fell quiet again. Sarah became suddenly aware that she was still holding Daniel's hand. She let go quickly, heat flooding her face. I should feed Grace, she said. Sarah. Daniel caught her arm gently. Are you really sure about this? Because once we do it, there's no going back. You'll be tied to me, to this ranch, to this life. If you have any doubts, I don't. Sarah turned to face him fully. I'm terrified, yes. This is happening fast, and everything could still go wrong. But I don't doubt this. I don't doubt you. You should, Daniel said quietly. I'm not a good bet, Sarah. I'm a rancher, barely making ends meet. I've got a past I'm not proud of. I've already lost one family, Martha and her children. What if I fail you, too? What if you don't? Sarah reached up and touched his face, the first time she'd initiated contact. What if this works? What if we build something good here? Daniel closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. I want that so badly it scares me. Then let's be scared together. They stood like that for a long moment, Grace sleeping nearby, the fire crackling, the night pressing close around the small house. Then Daniel opened his eyes and smiled. A real, full smile that transformed his entire face. All right, he said. Let's do this properly then, or as properly as we can manage. He disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small wooden box. Inside was a simple gold ring, worn and tarnished, but clearly precious. It was Martha's, he said. She gave it to me before she died. Made me promise I'd give it to someone who deserved it. He held it up to the firelight. I think you do. Sarah's throat tightened. Daniel, I can't take your stepmother's ring. She'd want you to have it. She'd want... His voice broke. She'd want me to have what she never got. A real marriage, a real family, a chance to build something that lasts. Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real, I'll take care of it, she promised. I know you will. The next 2 hours passed in strange suspension. Sarah cleaned the house, not because it needed cleaning, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Daniel built up the fire until the room was almost too warm. Grace woke and fussed, and Sarah nursed her while Daniel made coffee. They didn't drink. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? In a few hours, they'd be married, bound together legally and spiritually. The weight of it pressed down on Sarah, but not unpleasantly. It felt right, somehow inevitable. She thought about Thomas and whether he'd approve. Probably not. Thomas had been jealous of even casual male attention. But Thomas was gone, and Grace needed a father. Sarah needed a partner. And Daniel needed... What did Daniel need? Sarah realized she didn't fully know. Protection from loneliness, maybe. Someone to share the burden of the ranch. A chance to prove he wasn't like the men who'd failed Martha. Whatever he needed, Sarah hoped she could provide it. When horses finally sounded in the yard, they both jumped. Daniel grabbed the rifle, but it was Mr. Chen returning with a small elderly man bundled in heavy furs. Reverend Douglas, the old man said as he stamped snow from his boots. Mr. Chen tells me you need a wedding performed urgently. Yes, sir, Daniel said. I know the circumstances are unusual, son. I've been performing marriages for 40 years. I've seen unusual. Reverend Douglas's eyes moved between Daniel and Sarah, assessing. The question is whether this is right. Whether you're both entering freely and with clear minds. We are, Sarah said firmly. Both of you? Yes, Daniel said. Both of us. The Reverend studied them a moment longer, then nodded. All right, then. Let's begin. Mr. Chen, you'll stand as witness? Gladly. They arranged themselves in front of the fireplace. Sarah held Grace against her chest. She couldn't imagine doing this without her daughter present. Daniel stood beside her, close enough that their arms brushed. Reverend Douglas opened a worn Bible. Marriage is a sacred covenant, he began, not to be entered lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. The words washed over Sarah. She'd heard them before at her wedding to Thomas, but they felt different now. More real, more binding. Daniel Frost, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, to love and to cherish till death do you part? I do. Daniel's voice was steady. Sarah Brennan, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Sarah looked at Daniel, at this man who'd saved her, protected her, given her choices when she had none, at this stranger who was about to become her husband. I do, she said. The ring. Daniel took Martha's ring from his pocket and slid it onto Sarah's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The gold was warm against her skin. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Douglas smiled. You may kiss the bride. Daniel hesitated. Sarah realized this would be their first kiss, the seal on their marriage, the beginning of everything. She lifted her face to his, Grace between them, and waited. The kiss was gentle, brief, more a promise than a passion. But when Daniel pulled back, his eyes held something Sarah had never seen before, something like wonder. "Hello, wife," he whispered. "Hello, husband," she replied. Mr. Chen clapped them both on the back. "Congratulations. Now let's get this documented properly, Reverend. You have the papers?" They signed the marriage certificate by firelight. Daniel's signature bold and clear, Sarah's shaking slightly, but legible. Mr. Chen and Reverend Douglas signed as witnesses. When it was done, Reverend Douglas folded the paper carefully and handed it to Daniel. "Keep this safe," he said. "I suspect you'll need it." "Thank you," Daniel said. "Both of you, for coming out here, for doing this. Just doing God's work, son." The Reverend pulled his furs back on. "And for what it's worth, I think you two will be good together. I've seen enough marriages to know when one has a chance. This one does." After they left, Sarah and Daniel stood alone in the house that was now legally theirs together. Husband and wife, partners, family. "I should sleep in the barn," Daniel said finally. "Give you privacy." "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "We're married now, properly married. You sleep by the fire like you have been. I'm not ready for more than that. Not yet. But I'm not ready for you to leave either." She touched the ring on her finger. "Stay, please." Daniel nodded. "All right, I'll stay." They prepared for bed in awkward silence, Sarah retreating to the bedroom with Grace, Daniel building up the fire and laying out his bedroll. When Sarah emerged in her nightgown to get water, Daniel carefully averted his eyes. "Daniel," Sarah said quietly. "Yes?" "Thank you for this, for everything." He looked at her, then really looked at her. "I should be thanking you. You just saved my life as much as I saved yours." "How do you figure that?" "Because without you, this place was just a ranch. Now it's a home." He smiled. "Good night, Sarah Frost." Sarah Frost. Her new name. It felt strange on her ears, but not wrong. "Good night, Daniel." She closed the bedroom door and climbed into bed with Grace. Through the thin walls, she could hear Daniel moving around, settling in for the night. Her husband. She was married again to a man she barely knew, in circumstances even more desperate than her first marriage. But somehow this felt more real, more true. Sarah touched the ring on her finger and let herself imagine a future. Not just survival, but life. Not just safety, but happiness. Daniel working the ranch. Grace growing up here, learning to ride. Maybe other children eventually. A real family built on choice and respect, and something that might grow into love. It was a fragile hope. Garrett could still destroy it tomorrow. The sheriff could arrest Daniel. Judge Morrison could annul the marriage. But tonight, in this moment, Sarah let herself believe it would work out. Because she'd made a choice. She'd chosen Daniel, chosen this life, chosen to fight. And that choice, more than anything, made her feel like herself again. Outside, the wind died down. The storm passed. Stars emerged in the clear winter sky, bright and cold and beautiful. And in the small ranch house, two people, who'd been strangers a month ago, slept as husband and wife, ready to face whatever morning would bring together. Dawn came too quickly. Sarah woke to Grace's soft whimpering and the smell of coffee already brewing. For a confused moment, she forgot about the wedding, about Garrett, about everything except the warmth of the bed. Then she saw Martha's ring on her finger, and reality crashed back. She was married to Daniel Frost, and Garrett would be here today with the sheriff. Sarah dressed quickly and carried Grace into the main room. Daniel was at the stove, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt. He'd looked up when she entered, and something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe, or surprise, at seeing his wife for the first time in daylight. "Coffee's ready," he said. "And I made porridge." "Thank you." Sarah settled Grace in her cradle and accepted the cup Daniel offered. Their fingers brushed, and she felt heat flood her face. Everything felt different now. Every small interaction weighted with new meaning. "Carlos and Miguel should be back by noon," Daniel said, "if they made good time in Denver. And Garrett could come any time." Daniel moved to the window and looked out at the empty yard. "We need to be ready." They spent the morning preparing. Daniel loaded the rifle and his pistol, checking ammunition. Sarah packed a bag with essentials, food, clothes, Grace's things, in case they needed to run. Neither spoke much. The tension built like pressure before a storm. Mid-morning, horses sounded from the south. Daniel grabbed his rifle but relaxed when Carlos and Miguel rode into view, leading 2 horses instead of 6. They looked exhausted, their faces gray with cold and lack of sleep. "Well?" Daniel asked as they dismounted. Carlos pulled a leather pouch from his coat. $240. Best we could do. The horse traders in Denver were suspicious about why we were selling in winter. Drove the prices down. Daniel took the pouch and counted quickly. Combined with what they already had, it came to $390. 90 more than they needed. "You did good," Daniel said. "Both of you." "Did we get enough?" Miguel asked. "More than enough." Daniel looked at Sarah. "We can pay Garrett and still have money left over." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd scraped together the money. Garrett couldn't touch her now. "There's more," Carlos said. "We heard things in Denver about Garrett." "What things?" "He's wanted. Not officially, but the territorial marshal has been asking questions. Something about a woman who disappeared last year after Garrett claimed her for debt." Carlos's expression was grim. "They never found her body, but everyone knows what happened." Sarah's blood went cold. She'd come so close to that fate. If Daniel hadn't bid at the auction, if he hadn't fought for her. "Does the sheriff know?" Daniel asked. "If he does, he's ignoring it. Garrett pays well for cooperation." Miguel spat into the snow. "The whole system is rotten, boss." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but it's the system we have, and we're going to use it." He turned to Sarah. "Show them your hand." Sarah held up her left hand where Martha's ring gleamed in the winter sunlight. Carlos and Miguel's eyes widened. "You got married?" Carlos asked. "When?" "Last night," Sarah said. Reverend Douglas performed the ceremony. It's legal and properly witnessed. Miguel let out a whoop and clapped Daniel on the back. "Boss, you should have told us. We'd have brought champagne from Denver." "It wasn't that kind of wedding," Daniel said, but he was smiling. It was a strategic marriage to protect Sarah from Garrett's claim. "Strategic?" Carlos looked between them. "Is that what we're calling it?" "That's what it is," Sarah said firmly. Though, even as she spoke, she wondered if that was entirely true. Last night hadn't felt strategic. It had felt real. They were still standing in the yard discussing plans when more horses appeared from the north. 6 riders this time, moving in tight formation. Garrett led them, with Sheriff Coleman beside him, and 4 rough-looking men behind. "Get inside," Daniel said to Sarah. "Take Grace and lock the door." "No." Sarah's voice was steady. "I'm staying. Whatever happens, I'm staying." Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The riders were already crossing into the yard. Garrett dismounted with a smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Frost," he called. "Time's up. You got my money, or should I take what I came for?" "I have your money." Daniel pulled the leather pouch from his coat. $300. What Harold Brennan owed you, according to your fraudulent claim. Garrett's smile faded. "How'd you raise that much?" "That's my business." Daniel tossed the pouch to the ground at Garrett's feet. "Count it. It's all there." Garrett picked up the pouch slowly, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. He counted the money twice, then looked at the sheriff. "It's 300, he admitted. "But that doesn't change anything. I still have legal claim to the woman. The auction was invalid because my debt took precedence." "Your claim is void," Daniel said. "Mrs. Brennan isn't available to be claimed." "And why is that?" "Because she's my wife now. Legally married 3 hours after you left here 2 days ago." Daniel pulled the marriage certificate from his pocket, signed by Reverend Douglas and witnessed by William Chen. "Completely legal." The sheriff took the certificate and examined it. His weathered face showed nothing, but Sarah saw his jaw tighten. He knew what this meant. "It's legitimate," Sheriff Coleman said, finally. "Married women can't be claimed for their late husband's family debts. She's Frost's responsibility now, not Brennan's estate." "That's convenient," Garrett snarled. "Real convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "The timing doesn't matter," Daniel said. "The law is clear. Sarah is my wife. You have no claim on her. This is fraud. You married her to cheat me out of what I'm owed. I married her because I wanted to, because she wanted to. Our reasons are our own." Daniel's voice hardened. "Now take your money and get off my property." Garrett's face went purple with rage. For a moment, Sarah thought he'd go for his gun. His hand twitched toward his hip, and Carlos and Miguel moved to flank Daniel, their own hands ready. "Stand down, Garrett," Sheriff Coleman said quietly. "You got your money. The debt's satisfied. Let it go." "Let it go?" Garrett rounded on the sheriff. "You know what she's worth? A woman like that, young and healthy, with a baby. I could have made 10 times what Brennan owed me." The casual cruelty of the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd known men saw her as property, but hearing it spoken so plainly still shocked her. "Get off this ranch," Sarah said. Her voice cut through the tension. "You have your money. You have no legal claim. You're trespassing now." Garrett turned to stare at her. "You think you're safe now? Think marrying Frost protects you?" "I know it does." Sarah stepped forward, Grace in her arms. "And I know what you did to that woman last year, the one who disappeared after you claimed her for debt. I know the territorial marshal is asking questions." Garrett's face went white. "You don't know anything." "I know enough." Sarah's hands tightened on Grace. "You come near me or my daughter again, and I'll make sure the marshal hears every detail. I'll testify. I'll bring witnesses. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. You're bluffing. Try me." They stared at each other across the snowy yard. Sarah felt power flowing through her. Real power. Not the desperate strength of survival, but the solid confidence of someone who knew her ground. She was Sarah Frost now. She had a husband, a home, witnesses, the law on her side. She wasn't property anymore. Garrett must have seen it in her face because he took a step back. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Yes, it is," Sheriff Coleman said. "Garrett, you got your money. Mrs. Frost made herself clear. You stay away from this ranch and these people, or I'll arrest you for harassment. Understand?" Garrett's jaw worked, but he nodded. He grabbed the money pouch and mounted his horse, with vicious jerks on the reins. His men followed, clearly relieved to be leaving. They rode out fast, snow kicking up behind them. Sheriff Coleman remained. He looked at Daniel, then at Sarah, then at the marriage certificate still in his hand. "This is legitimate," he said, "but it was also rushed. You sure about this, ma'am? About marrying a man you barely know?" "I'm sure," Sarah said, "because if you're being coerced in any way, I'm not being coerced." Sarah moved to stand beside Daniel. "I married him freely, by my own choice, and I'd do it again." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. He handed the certificate back to Daniel. "All right, then. Congratulations on your marriage." He touched his hat brim. "Frost, you take care of them. And Mrs. Frost, if you ever need help, my door's open." "Thank you, Sheriff," Sarah said. After he left, silence fell over the ranch. Carlos and Miguel stood in the yard, grinning. Daniel held the marriage certificate like it might disappear if he let go. Sarah clutched Grace and tried to process what had just happened. They'd won. Garrett was gone. The threat was over. "We did it," Carlos said finally. "We actually did it." "Thanks to you two," Daniel said. "You rode hard to Denver and back. You made this possible." "Thanks to all of us," Sarah corrected. "We did this together." Miguel laughed. "We're a good team, I think. The Frost Ranch family." Family. The word settled over Sarah like a warm blanket. She looked at Carlos and Miguel, at Daniel standing beside her, at Grace sleeping peacefully through the drama. This was her family now, not by blood, but by choice. "Come on," Daniel said. "Let's get inside. We should celebrate." They spent the afternoon in the warm house, drinking coffee that Carlos spiked with whiskey, eating bread and cheese, talking and laughing with the relief of people who'd survived something terrible. Grace passed from arms to arms, everyone wanting to hold her. Sarah watched her daughter smile at these rough, kind men and felt something precious taking root. As evening approached, Carlos and Miguel finally headed back to the bunkhouse, teasing Daniel mercilessly about married life. When the door closed behind them, Sarah and Daniel were alone for the first time since the wedding. The house felt different, quieter, more intimate. "I should thank you," Sarah said, "for everything you did. The money, the marriage, standing up to Garrett." "You don't need to thank me." Daniel moved to the fire and added wood. "We're partners now, husband and wife. We protect each other." "Is that all we are? Partners?" Daniel turned to look at her. "What do you want us to be?" Sarah took a breath. "I don't know yet. This all happened so fast, but I know I don't regret it. Marrying you, coming here, any of it. Neither do I." Daniel crossed the room to stand in front of her. "Sarah, I know this marriage started as strategy, but I meant those vows. Every word. I want to build a real life with you, a real family." "So do I." Sarah touched the ring on her finger. "But I need time to trust this, to trust you, to trust that this isn't going to fall apart. Take all the time you need." Daniel's voice was gentle. "I'm not going anywhere." They stood close, not quite touching, the firelight casting shadows between them. Sarah felt the pull toward him, not just gratitude or relief, but something deeper, something that could grow into love if she let it. "Grace needs to eat," she said, finally breaking the spell. "And I should start dinner." "I'll help." They worked together in the kitchen, falling into an easy rhythm. Daniel peeled potatoes while Sarah mixed cornbread batter. They talked about small things, repairs needed on the barn, supplies to buy in spring, whether the chickens would survive the next storm. Domestic conversations, married conversations. It felt right. After dinner, after Grace was asleep, they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. Sarah mended one of Daniel's shirts while he read from a worn book of poetry. The words washed over her, beautiful and old. "Read that last one again," she said. Daniel glanced up, surprised. "Which one?" "The one about home, about finding where you belong." He found the page and read in his low, steady voice, words about journeys and rest, about wandering and arriving, about the heart knowing home when it finds it. When he finished, Sarah's eyes were damp. "That's how I feel," she said quietly. "Like I've been wandering for so long, and I finally stopped." "Me too." Daniel closed the book. "Since Martha died, since I lost my family, I felt like I was just going through motions. Working the ranch, because that's what you do. Surviving because giving up wasn't an option. But I wasn't really living. And now I feel alive again." He looked at her directly. "Because of you. Because of Grace. Because this house isn't empty anymore." Sarah set down her mending. "Daniel, I need to tell you something." "All right. I'm scared." The words came out in a rush. "I'm scared this is too good to be true. I'm scared you'll change your mind or realize you made a mistake, or I won't." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Daniel leaned forward. "Sarah, I've lived alone for 5 years. I know the difference between loneliness and peace. What I feel with you here, that's peace. That's home. I'm not giving that up. Not ever." "Promise me," Sarah whispered. "Promise me you'll be patient while I figure out how to trust this." "I promise." Daniel reached out and took her hand. "However long it takes." They sat like that, hands joined, until the fire burned low. Then Daniel stood and prepared his bedroll by the hearth, while Sarah checked on Grace one more time. At the bedroom door, she paused. "Daniel?" "Yes?" "Thank you for choosing me at that auction. Out of all the reasons you could have had, thank you for choosing me." "There was never anyone else," Daniel said. "From the moment I saw you on that courthouse floor, it was always you." Sarah carried those words into the bedroom and held them close as she drifted to sleep. The winter passed in small, precious moments. Daniel teaching Sarah to shoot so she could defend herself. Carlos showing Grace how to make sounds by tapping spoons on the pots. Miguel singing lullabies in Spanish while Sarah cooked. Long evenings by the fire, with Daniel reading aloud, and Sarah's hands busy with mending. They learned each other slowly. Sarah discovered that Daniel woke before dawn every morning without fail. That he hummed while he worked. That he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. Daniel learned that Sarah sang when she thought she was alone. That she checked door locks obsessively. That she cried sometimes in the night over losses she couldn't name. They didn't rush toward intimacy. They orbited each other carefully, building trust through daily kindnesses. A cup of coffee made just right. A shirt mended without being asked. Small gestures that said, "I see you. I know you. I'm staying." Spring came late that year. Snow lingered in the high passes until April. But when it finally broke, the world transformed overnight. Green shoots pushed through mud. Calves were born in quick succession, filling the pastures with new life. Birds returned, filling the air with sound. and Sarah, checking her body's rhythms, realized she was carrying Daniel's child. She told him one evening in May, while they sat on the porch, watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Grace was asleep inside, and Carlos and Miguel were down at the creek checking fishing lines. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said simply. Daniel's hands stilled on the rope he'd been mending. He looked at her, his eyes wide. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "How do you feel about it?" It was so perfectly Daniel to ask that question first. Not how he felt, but how she felt. "Scared," Sarah admitted. "I almost died having Grace. Thomas's mother died in childbirth. I know the risks." "We'll get you to the best doctor. I'll take you to Denver if I have to." "Daniel." Sarah took his hand. "I'm scared, but I'm also happy. I want this baby. I want our baby." His face broke into a smile so bright it took her breath away. "Our baby," he repeated. "Sarah, His voice caught. "Thank you for this. For everything. Thank you for being the kind of man worth having babies with." He pulled her close then, careful and gentle, and Sarah let herself lean into his strength. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd chosen, and it was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. The baby came in January, delivered by Mrs. Chen and Reverend Douglas's wife, in the warm bedroom of the ranch house. It was a long labor and a hard one, but Sarah survived. Daniel paced the main room for 12 hours straight, Carlos and Miguel keeping vigil with him. When Sarah finally called his name, Daniel burst into the bedroom. She was propped against pillows, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny red-faced baby. "A son," she said. "We have a son." Daniel knelt beside the bed and stared at the infant in wonder. "He's perfect. What should we name him?" "Thomas," Daniel said without hesitation. "After your first husband. He should know about the man who came before." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "And Jacob, for your brother. Thomas Jacob Frost." "Perfect!" Daniel touched his son's small hand, and the baby's fingers closed around his in a grip surprisingly strong. "Hello, Thomas. I'm your father, and I promise you I'll be here. Always." Years passed. Grace grew tall and strong, learning to ride before she could read, fearless and kind. Thomas followed behind her, quieter but steady, with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Then came little Martha, named for the stepmother who taught Daniel what real family meant. The ranch prospered. Daniel and Sarah worked side by side, building something that would last generations. Carlos and Miguel stayed on, becoming uncles to the children, pillars of the small family they'd created. Sometimes Sarah thought about that day in the courthouse, about standing on an auction block with Grace in her arms, certain her life was over, about the desperation and fear that had consumed her. And then she'd look at Daniel teaching Thomas to mend fence, at Grace reading to Martha on the porch, at Carlos and Miguel arguing good-naturedly over whose turn it was to churn butter, at the life they'd built together from nothing but determination and hope. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch swing he'd built last summer, watching stars emerge over the mountains. "About how far we've come," Sarah said. "About that day you bid on me. Best money I ever spent." Daniel's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You know what the crazy thing is? I don't even remember the moment you made that first bid. Everything was such a blur. But I remember the moment you said you'd be father and husband both. I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, I could survive this." "You did more than survive, Sarah. You thrived. We both did, because we chose each other." Sarah looked up at him. Not once, but every day since. That's what makes this real. Daniel kissed her forehead. Every day, for the rest of my life. Inside, one of the children called for water. A horse nickered in the barn. The evening wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. All the small sounds of home, of family, of a life built on love and choice, and unwavering commitment. Sarah Frost had been sold with a baby in her arms, and a cowboy had promised to be father and husband both. Against all odds, in the face of cruelty and corruption, and a world that saw women as property, they'd made that promise real. They'd built a home where there had been only wilderness. They'd created a family where there had been only loneliness. They'd chosen each other again and again until those choices became unbreakable bonds. And in the end, that was all any marriage was.